Today on Between the Lines, how our brains' flaws shape our lives with Professor Dean Buonomano. Welcome, I'm Barry Kibrick. Dr. Buonomano is a professor in the departments of neurobiology and psychology at the Brain Research Institute at UCLA. With his book, Brain Bugs, he provides insights into the brain's inherent imperfections along with the tools to correct them. Professor Buonomano, welcome to Between the Lines.
It's a pleasure to be here, Barry.
Now, this book is all about how the little glitches in our brain, our flaws, our bugs, as you call them, shape our lives. How we think when the brain is working at its utmost perfection, that's when we're all a-go. But the truth is, some of the bugs in our brains are what motivate us, what make us do the things we do.
Absolutely. And I think we normally look at the brain as an astonishing organ, which it is, and it generates everything from consciousness, awareness, intelligence, emotions, creativity. But it's an imperfect organ, and it's the most complex device in the universe, to the best of our knowledge. But it's far from perfect, and its imperfections have a very influential role in who we are as human beings. And by peering into the mechanisms of the brain, the building blocks of the brain, we can learn not only a lot about ourselves and what we do well, why we recognize patterns very well in a way much more superior than to computers, but why we do other things very poorly. And those things that we do poorly, whether they're in the realm of simply memorizing long lists of names or doing numerical calculations, or making decisions that require balancing short-term benefits and long-term consequences, are things the brain doesn't do too well, and those have a big influence on our lives.
But it seems like from everything I've read here, is the biggest reason why those bugs exist is evolution. It's as if, in a strange way, our mind and brain have created this wonderful new society world that's, for literally for tens of thousands of years, there were almost no changes. Then all of a sudden, the Enlightenment and maybe a few hundred years before, and we begin to make these chunks of leaps. And that's why it seems as if, as intelligent as our brain is, the bugs are there still because evolutionarily we have not caught up to it.
Absolutely. I think there's sort of two reasons that we have many of the bugs. First is exactly what you just said, that we currently live in a time and place we really weren't designed to live in, if you will. And the second has to do with the building blocks of the brain, how the brain is constructed. But what you just mentioned about we live in a modern society which is full of things that didn't exist 100,000 years ago. The fact that we're here on TV and we can observe things as if we're actually observing them in the first person, but we're not. They could be fiction. It's something that often fools the brain. The fact that we live in a digital world where numbers are so important. Primitive societies, many of them didn't even have a number system that went beyond 2 or 3. We live in a society where food is, for some of us, overly available. And these are all very unnatural circumstances that the brain, in many ways, wasn't tuned to cope with.
The one thing, though, that existed throughout possibly eternity, we are not sure for certain, even all the physicists I have on here, they go probability, but not certainty, but is fear. That has always been the ultimate motivator. And the fears that our brain is evolutionarily aware of are sometimes very different than the real fears we have to deal with now. That was some of the most fascinating parts about it, because the fear doesn't go away, but what we're afraid of is sometimes bugged.
Absolutely. And fear is a fascinating emotion because in many ways it's a primordial emotion, in my opinion, in that it probably was the first one to drive behavior for animals to anticipate dangerous situations. And one of the examples I discuss is how fear is outdated. And I personally like the example of looking at other animals, and skunks I think is illuminating. And a skunk has this fantastic defense mechanism, right? In that if it's faced with an enemy, it will turn around, lift its tail, and spray, and it works very well. But if the enemy in this case is a car, it's a rather tragic response, and because they did not evolve to cope with the world that we have built. And our own fears have very similar consequences. So of the people you and I know, I'm sure we know of people who have a very severe phobia of snakes or spiders or predators. And that makes sense. We understand why that is in an ecological perspective, because these are very dangerous things. But most of the people we know probably have never had a near-death experience produced by a shark or a spider or a snake. But probably a lot of people we know had near-death experiences with cars. So why aren't we more fearful of cars? Why don't we have more car phobia? Because those are things that in our modern life have a much more impact on the quality of life and the dangers in the real world.
You do something else here, though. You also extrapolate how sociologically that affects us. There was some statistics that are almost mind-blowing when you think about it. There was obviously from 1995, you give this example, to 2005, there were 3,200 deaths on American soil due to terrorism.
Yeah.
Horrible, horrific, and we need to do everything to stop it. Yet, like you said before, the fear of cars, during that same period of time, there wasn't 3,200 deaths, 450,000 deaths. Yet we spent $700 billion on terrorism and maybe a few billion on highway improvement. Now, I'm not saying, I'm using that as just an example of how that fear could then lead to fear-mongering as well. And that's why these bugs and being aware of them are important, so that as a society and as individuals, we do not become manipulated by the bugs that are just naturally in our brains.
Right. I do think, and that's my opinion, that the fact that our fear module is so outdated, it's so archaic, that it makes us susceptible to fear-mongering. And that fear-mongering can come out in various different forms. And I think it is worth considering what you just brought up, that maybe our reaction to violent events, particularly events perpetrated by others, as in the case of terrorism, brings up the archaic whispers of our genes more so than car accidents. And the fact that that may be the case alters policy, and we end up as a society spending much more money towards those things that have an emotional content, such as terrorism, as opposed to the things that by many measures are more likely to harm us. And I think what we should fear is probably only tenuously related to what we do fear in the modern world.
Well, the words you use, and I could probably use this in every show. Every show has some element of this balance. The balance between what is the real fear, and as you say, part of that fear is what leads us to curiosity. It's what leads us to adventure. It's what leads us to travel to the moon, and in a certain way. So we have to balance. That seems to be, if I can say it in every show, balance.
Yes.
Isn't that the amazing equilibrium that needs to take place?
And maybe that's what's off, because maybe evolution tuned us to balance curiosity and fear, being adventurous and being conservative, in a world that didn't have many of the modern dangers that the current world has. So maybe it's just the tuning that's off, is to properly balance what we should fear a bit and the trade-off between being adventurous and being conservative or fearful.
You also make it clear that the brain is a web. It's all intertwined. And one of those things that outsprings from fear and curiosity is what you call the greatest mystery of all, and that's consciousness. that's something that it's hard to put literally your finger on it, isn't it? When I spoke to even brain surgeons and other doctors who work there, that's the thing that makes them go into science rather than philosophy. Absolutely. Because once you start thinking of consciousness, boy, that's a hard thing to grasp.
Absolutely. So first, what you mentioned about the web, and this is something that I think is important to remember, is the brain is an incredibly intricate web of neurons. So these are the building blocks of the brains. We have maybe 100 billion neurons. So this is probably more neurons in our brain than there are pages on the World Wide Web. And we have 100 trillion synapses connecting them. Now, this other issue of consciousness is, in my mind, there's no doubt, it has to be, if not the biggest, one of the biggest mysteries in science. And we're not even close to understanding how consciousness emerges from this incredibly intricate web of neurons in our brain. Chemically speaking, the brain and the liver are pretty close, in terms of their molecular composition. But one generates consciousness and the other, degrades glucose and processes, helps with digestion. So how consciousness emerges from the brain has to be one of the biggest mysteries in science.
I'm going to get back to exploring with that, but I want to go in a certain order because I almost think I should have ended with consciousness because I think this. So I'm going to, but I had to leave it there because I wanted it to be implanted. The next thing I want to talk about, though, is my own pet peeve: memory. Now people look at this show and they go, "How does this guy remember all?" Well, the truth is, I have notes. I have my memory.
That was my thought precisely when I watched your show. How does he remember all these authors that he's interviewed?
Something? I actually forget the authors. I mean, because you know what? And you use it here. What's his name is the biggest question we often ask. Because the brain, as you said, from its the beginnings of evolution, at most maybe you knew a couple of tribesmen, your wife if you had one, and maybe your kid. That was all you had to. But so memory, really in our modern society, and when you just said trillions of web pages, the information overload, and numbers themselves, they're impossible for humans to really calculate up to more than 4 to 10. I mean, literally hold them all at once in your memory, yet you also tell us we are our memory. If there's anything close to consciousness, it's what we remember. But the brain bugs are in the names, the numbers, the things oftentimes we're asked at school, where the thing we're great at are the concepts.
Yes.
And I always kept telling, and I'm so glad I read it here. I was so concerned because the concepts, that is what sticks in my brain.
And again, so this I think is, and I'm glad to hear that, because for me, I see people like yourself, and it's, wow, how are their memories so much better? So it's always nice to hear that other people have these same issues. But everybody should know, yes, it's part of being human. Having a bad memory for names is part of human nature. And again, this brings us back to 2 basic points about the brain. The first is it's designed by the evolutionary process in which it did not evolve to learn names. If you think of other animals, as far as we know, no other animal they can identify each other. My cat can identify its dog, the dog, and each other. But as far as we know, no other animal has names for the other individuals of their tribe. And because names, first place, requires language. So it's no surprise that the brain did not evolve to store names. But the second phenomenon that's very interesting goes back to what I refer to as the associative architecture of the brain, which relates to what we just mentioned about how everything is connected. And a very interesting example of this is what's called the Baker-Baker paradox. And here, people perhaps notice this. They're more likely to say, oh, what's his name? I can't remember. He was a movie producer, or he was a waiter. So we know who we're thinking of. We know their professions, but we often forget the name. And the issue here is that studies show that if we show pictures of people to subjects, and they're asked, this is Mr. Baker, and another picture they're shown, this is a Baker. So people memorize both the profession and the names. People are much more apt to remember the profession, even if it's the same name. So even when Baker is used as a name, people are still more likely to remember Baker as a profession. So why is that? Well, it's because it's associative. When you think of the word baker, the profession baker, what do you think of? What pops into your head?
A guy with a hat working on the flour and either tossing it up and around or putting it in the oven.
And making our pastries. So you have implicit associations with the profession baker that somehow, if the profession baker is one website, it automatically contaminates some other related websites, some other concepts in our brain. And these will be pastries or funny hats or getting up early. And when you hear the name baker, then it sort of stands alone. Not many other things are triggered.
But this leads to some of the parts that, again, I think are sociologically significant. You talk about these words framing, anchoring, and priming. And just that, when you say baker, you're priming someone to start to think of something. And you really, you looked into journalists, you looked into the judicial system where this happens, even in the medical system, where we prime a certain thought. It is associative, so it leads to something, but it may not be the right thing because we primed the pump, so to speak, in a certain way. And you give examples here where innocent people are sitting in jails, where things that could have been easily cured medically are not, because we've had certain bugs that stopped us from going the full distance, so to speak.
Right. And so when we have this priming effect, and it's a very basic effect, and it drives much of our conversations. If you meet somebody in the street and they say, oh, I just got back from Italy, and then that primes your memories of you being in Rome and perhaps the museums you went to. And so if I say, I like sushi, and ask you, now think of a country, I've just biased your chances of thinking of Japan just because I said sushi. And that's how the brain works. These concepts, information is stored in our brain by what it's connected to. So sushi might be connected to Japan and to fish and to the ocean. And these are links that are formed, presumably because neurons represent sushi and some other neurons represent Japan, and the synapses between them, the synapses are formed between those groups of neurons. And this underlies a very fundamental principle of the brain, which is what neuroscientists refer to as neurons that fire together, wire together. So experience things together seems to make the neurons representing them connect to each other, talk to each other. And that underlies our ability to, one thing, to prime the other.
There's one part here then that started to really pique my interest, because I got almost mixed messages from the book as well. And by the way, I think it's designed to do that. That's because the bug is, there is this yin and yang here that goes on.
Features and bugs.
Features. And in fact, the bug is usually just the flip side of the best feature.
It's
so
true.
Am I right? That's what we
true.
have to be concerned about.
Absolutely.
You don't want to eliminate these bugs because you would eliminate the feature.
Some of them you definitely don't want to eliminate, yeah.
One of them that fascinated me, though, was the discussion you have in here about the supernatural, religion, and spirituality. There's an element of that is obviously the greatest quest for mankind. Why are we here? Were we created by something? Did we just pop out of the ooze? Those questions are the questions that the great scientists of all time grapple with. And yet, if the bugs get in there more than the questions and the, as you said before, the curiosity versus the fear, that's where we again have to be careful, have to balance ourselves so that we're not going off on a cliff that we can't come back from.
Right. And supernatural beliefs have been with us from, as far as we know, from the dawn of man, of course, and they presumably play a very important role in human interactions and human culture. And supernatural beliefs plus religion have brought an immense amount of compassion and altruism and solace and joy to the world. But there is a flip side, and they've also brought some suffering and unreason to the world. And the question I try to explore there, and as you said, people have debated these issues for literally for centuries, is why are supernatural beliefs so universal? Why are they so powerful? And the view I take, which has been proposed by many others, is perhaps they're built into the brain. They come pre-installed, if you will, and they're part of the structure. So we, in the same sense that we come with hints as to what we should fear, supernatural beliefs might be part of our very nature.
That's so interesting. When I was reading that, I was saying, well, if it's sort of implanted, that almost goes more to the very religious side on a certain extent rather than, man creating